I think I didn't do anything wrong, just a playful moment at a party. But the second his friend leaned in and kissed me, and I brushed it off as a game, my husband's face hardened. Hours later, I was outside with my bags and a stack of legal documents in my hands. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. The night of the party was supposed to be nothing more than an evening of laughter, wine, and stories. But for me, it became the spark that unraveled everything. I stood in the living room of Damien's house, surrounded by old friends of Ethan's, people who had known him since college, and I felt the pressure to be the lively one, the wife who wasn't boring, the woman who made a dull gathering sparkle. The music played softly, glasses clinked, and I told myself I had to keep up the performance. Ethan had been sitting in the corner, polite but quiet, sipping his drink, while I moved among the guests, chatting and laughing. Damien, with his usual smirk, leaned in too close, brushing my arm when he passed me a glass of wine, and I didn't push him away. I told myself it was harmless, that Ethan needed to loosen up and stop acting like every interaction was a threat. When the inevitable happened and Damien leaned forward, pressing his lips to mine in front of everyone, I laughed instead of recoiling. I shouted loud enough for the whole room to hear that it was just a game, just a silly dare, nothing worth making a scene over. Ethan's face, pale and tight, betrayed how much he disagreed. Instead of apologizing or stopping Damien, I waved it off like a joke, demanding that Ethan stop glaring, calling him uptight, insisting that everyone else could see it was harmless. I convinced myself that by laughing louder, I could drown out his discomfort, that by mocking his reaction, I could make him look like the unreasonable one. Naomi whispered in my ear that Ethan really needed to lighten up, that he was always too serious. Her words gave me fuel, and I grinned wider, telling the group that Ethan was acting like an old man trapped in rules nobody else believed in. Damien grinned at me with that smug satisfaction, like I had handed him permission to keep going. The others in the room laughed awkwardly, some nodding politely, others glancing at Ethan with discomfort, but I didn't care. In my mind, I was in control of the narrative, shaping myself as the playful, free-spirited wife unfairly chained to a paranoid husband. Ethan didn't shout, didn't throw his glass, didn't even confront Damien. He stood slowly, his chair scraping back against the floor, and with a calmness that unsettled me more than rage ever could, he took Amelia's hand and told her softly that they were leaving. I called after him that he was embarrassing himself, that people would think he couldn't take a joke. He didn't turn back. The room grew heavier without his presence, and I felt the stares, but I forced another laugh, holding my chin high. I claimed he was just too sensitive, that this was why people thought men like him were dull. Damien tried to continue joking, clinking his glass against mine, but even he seemed uneasy, sensing the lines had been crossed. Still, I kept insisting it was nothing, that my husband would come around once he cooled off. When the party ended, I stayed behind with Naomi and a few others, talking louder than usual to drown out the shame clawing at my chest. Naomi said Ethan would forgive me, that men always made a fuss only to return quietly later. I nodded, pretending to believe her, but the empty side of the bed that night was colder than I expected. Amelia's absence stung more than I wanted to admit. I told myself Ethan was punishing me unfairly, that keeping her away for the night was controlling, paranoid, cruel. The next morning, whispers had already spread. A co-worker texted, asking if it was true that Damien had kissed me in front of Ethan, her message laced with amusement and judgment. My fingers trembled as I typed back that it had been nothing, just a silly moment, Ethan's paranoia blowing it out of proportion. Yet the fact that I needed to explain myself so soon told me that the story had already gained weight. I told myself that if I controlled the version people heard, I could still win. So I framed Ethan as uptight, mocked him to Naomi again, and laughed about how a kiss meant nothing. But underneath, I felt the first cracks in the mask I had built. When Ethan didn't come home that evening, when his silence stretched across hours, my confidence faltered. I left him a message accusing him of overreacting, telling him Amelia needed her mother, demanding that he stop being dramatic. Still no answer. Naomi came over with wine, repeating her belief that this was temporary, that he was just sulking, but the truth was clear in her eyes. She wasn't sure anymore. I drank with her anyway, insisting that I had done nothing wrong, repeating the phrase like a charm to ward off the reality pressing in. By the second day, the silence was louder than any fight. Ethan hadn't called. Amelia hadn't been dropped off. I stormed to Damien's house, furious that he hadn't defended me more, demanding that he tell people it was just a game. He looked uncomfortable, muttering that maybe I had gone too far, that Ethan was his friend, and he didn't want to be in the middle. His retreat felt like betrayal, but I told myself he was just weak, another man afraid of conflict. I left his house more determined than ever to frame Ethan as the villain. I stood in front of our home that night, banging on the door, shouting for him to open it. When no answer came, I pounded harder, screaming that he couldn't lock me out, that he had no right to keep Amelia from me. I told myself the neighbors watching from their windows would see me as the wrong wife, not the reckless woman. But when Ethan's calm voice came from behind the door, telling me he had papers ready, my body chilled. He said simply that this wasn't a joke anymore. Then the slot of the door opened, and a thick envelope slid onto the porch. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and read the words that would define the weeks ahead: petition for separation, request for temporary custody. I shouted that he was paranoid, insecure, cruel, but the door stayed closed, and Amelia's shadow retreated from the stairwell upstairs. The laughter I had used to cover my guilt crumbled into silence as I stood alone on the porch, holding papers that made clear Ethan was no longer playing my game. The following days felt like a blur of whispers, side glances, and cold shoulders, yet I refused to admit I was losing control of the story. At the clinic, where I worked the reception desk, the chatter always quieted when I walked into the break room. I could feel their eyes following me, the way their voices dropped, and though nobody said it to my face, I knew what they were whispering. The kiss at the party, my laughter, Ethan walking out, it had spread faster than I expected. I told myself they were exaggerating, that they were jealous, that they wanted to see me stumble. When one of the nurses finally asked if it was true, if Damien had kissed me right in front of Ethan, I rolled my eyes and laughed. I told her it was just a game, a silly moment, nothing worth talking about. I claimed Ethan was insecure, too traditional, and that people needed to learn how to take a joke. She nodded politely, but I caught the flicker of judgment in her eyes. Even Damien, who passed by with a smirk that first morning, began avoiding me once he realized people were talking more about my behavior than his. His silence stung, but I told myself he was weak, that Ethan must have pressured him. At home, things were worse. I tried calling Ethan's phone repeatedly, leaving messages accusing him of overreacting, of using Amelia against me, of playing the victim to gain sympathy. Each call went unanswered. I sent texts demanding he bring Amelia back, warning him he would regret making me look like the bad one. His silence cut deeper than I wanted to admit, because I couldn't twist it. I couldn't fight against silence. Without his words, there was nothing for me to distort. Naomi came over with her usual glass of wine in hand, telling me I had to relax, that men always made a fuss but never followed through. She laughed when I told her about the separation papers, insisting it was just a scare tactic. Her reassurance comforted me for a moment, but when she left, the quiet of the apartment pressed in like a weight I couldn't lift. By the end of the week, Ethan invited his parents over for dinner, but not me. I only knew because Margaret called me earlier in the day to inform me, with her sharp voice dripping with disdain, that my presence wasn't welcome. She said I had humiliated her son in public, mocked his loyalty, and that a woman like me didn't deserve the family's respect. I shouted back that she had always hated me, that she had been waiting for me to slip so she could finally declare herself right. Margaret didn't raise her voice. She said only one sentence before hanging up. A child knows the difference between a game and betrayal. Her words echoed in my head even after the line went dead. That weekend, I decided to confront the issue head-on by showing up at the Varro family dinner anyway. Naomi encouraged me, saying it was my right as Ethan's wife to be there. I marched into the house, my head high, ready to prove that I wasn't intimidated. The table was set. Amelia sat quietly with her fork in hand. Ethan sat calm and still, and Margaret's eyes burned with cold fury. I forced a smile, claiming I was there to keep the family together, accusing them of trying to shut me out unfairly. Ethan didn't say a word, but Margaret wasted no time. She asked me bluntly if I thought it was acceptable to laugh while another man kissed me in front of my husband and daughter. I laughed louder, insisting again it was just a game, that Ethan had overreacted, that everyone was twisting it into something it wasn't. Amelia looked up at me then, her small eyes filled with confusion and hurt. She asked softly why I had let Damien kiss me. My chest tightened, but I brushed it off, saying it was nothing, saying adults sometimes played silly games. Margaret slammed her fork down, declaring that I was teaching Amelia lies. Harold said nothing, just lowered his head, disappointment heavy in his silence. I turned to Naomi for support, but even she looked uncertain, her eyes flickering nervously, as if she wanted to disappear. My laughter felt brittle, hollow, but I clung to it anyway, claiming again that Ethan was old-fashioned, that the real problem was his insecurity. Ethan stood slowly, his chair scraping back the same way it had at the party, and this time he didn't bother with excuses. He told Amelia it was time to leave, and that she didn't have to listen to things that weren't true. He gathered her hand in his, nodded to his parents, and walked out of the room. The slam of the door left me standing in the dining room, with Naomi shifting uncomfortably beside me, Margaret glaring, and Harold refusing to meet my gaze. I shouted after him that he was manipulating everyone, that he was playing the victim, that he was too weak to fight me openly. But his silence once again drowned me. Naomi whispered that maybe I should go, her tone quieter than before, and I realized even she was losing confidence in me. I stormed out, slamming the door behind me, still muttering that it was just a game, that everyone else was wrong. Yet, as I drove home that night, the weight of Amelia's question pressed against me. Why had I let Damien kiss me? The answer I gave her had sounded empty even to my own ears, and I hated how her small voice lingered longer than Margaret's accusations. Still, I told myself the only way to survive was to double down, to laugh louder, to blame Ethan harder. Because if I stopped, even for a second, I would have to admit the truth, that the game had ended the moment he closed the door on me. I woke up the next morning with a pounding headache, not from alcohol, but from the silence that had settled over everything. Ethan hadn't called, Amelia hadn't come by, and Naomi's texts had grown shorter, as if even she was beginning to run out of reassurance. I told myself he couldn't really mean to go through with separation, that he was just sulking, waiting for me to beg. I wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Instead, I marched back to the house, determined to reclaim my place. The driveway looked too neat, his car parked straight, Amelia's bike leaning against the garage, and for a moment, I imagined everything still belonged to me. I rang the bell, pounded on the door, called out his name. Nothing. I shouted that he couldn't lock me out, that this was still my home, that he had no right to keep my daughter from me. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, their eyes following me with pity or judgment, and I forced a laugh, yelling that my husband was throwing a tantrum like a child. Still no answer. Finally, the sound of footsteps inside. I felt triumph spark, thinking I had broken him, that he would open the door and admit he had been ridiculous. Instead, the slot in the door creaked open and a thick envelope slid out, landing at my feet with a dull thud. I picked it up, my hands trembling. Separation forms, custody requests, financial protections, legal stamps that looked far too official to be a bluff. I shouted through the door that he was paranoid, cruel, insecure, but his only response was silence. I caught a shadow moving on the stairs inside, Amelia, peeking down at me, her small face framed by the banister. Our eyes met for a split second before Ethan's voice called her back, calm and steady, and she disappeared. The door stayed closed. I screamed his name until my throat ached, but he never answered. When I stumbled back to the car, my chest was burning, my eyes stinging with tears I refused to let fall. I told myself he was using lawyers to scare me, that no judge would ever side with him over something so small. I clung to that thought like a lifeline. At work, however, the whispers grew louder. 2 nurses passed by me in the hall, muttering that Ethan had already filed papers. Damien walked past without meeting my eyes, and I hissed his name, demanding he back me up. He shifted uncomfortably, muttered that maybe it had gone too far, and walked away. His retreat left me exposed, and I snapped at him, loud enough for others to hear, calling him a coward. Their glances told me I was only digging myself deeper. That night, I decided to try another approach. I posted online, typing out a long message about how insecure husbands couldn't handle playful wives, how women like me were punished for having fun, how old-fashioned attitudes destroyed marriages. At first, a few friends clicked like. Naomi even added a laughing emoji, but then the silence stretched. No comments, no defense, just silence. I refreshed the page again and again, but the validation never came. I told myself people were afraid to side with me, that they didn't want to face Ethan's judgment. Still, the quiet was crushing. I couldn't resist showing up at the Varro house again the following weekend. Naomi came with me this time, though she seemed reluctant. Margaret opened the door with her lips pressed tight, asking coldly if I had no shame. I forced a smile, saying I was there to keep the family together, accusing her of poisoning Ethan against me. Margaret scoffed, calling me reckless. Harold sat at the dining table, staring down at his plate, avoiding my eyes. Amelia was there too, sitting small and silent, her fork untouched. I reached for her hand, but she pulled it away, looking down at her lap. The rejection stung, but I forced another laugh, saying she was just tired, that Ethan was filling her head with doubts. Margaret's voice sharpened, saying children knew more than I wanted to admit, and Harold sighed, muttering that vows were not games. Naomi tried to diffuse the tension, laughing awkwardly, saying Ethan had always been rigid. Her words fell flat in the heavy air. I lashed out then, raising my voice, accusing everyone of exaggerating, insisting again it had been nothing. Margaret's face hardened. Harold refused to look at me, and Amelia's small shoulders hunched as if she wanted to disappear. Ethan appeared at the doorway then, his presence calm and immovable. He didn't argue, he didn't even raise his voice. He told Amelia it was time to leave, and she slipped from her chair to his side. He gave me one long, steady look before guiding her out of the room. The door shut behind them, leaving silence heavier than any scream. When Naomi and I got back to my apartment, she was quiet, her earlier confidence fading. She admitted softly that maybe Ethan wasn't bluffing, that lawyers didn't get involved unless there was something real. I snapped at her, accusing her of betraying me, of siding with him. She didn't argue, just gathered her things and left early. I sat in the quiet after she was gone, staring at the envelope of documents still spread across the table. I whispered to myself that it was just a game, nothing more, that Ethan was paranoid. But the words felt brittle, empty, and for the first time, I wondered if the silence surrounding me meant everyone else already knew the game was over. I tried to convince myself that I still had control, that I could bend the story back in my favor if I just spoke louder, laughed harder, and acted as though nothing was wrong. At the clinic, I greeted everyone with a smile that felt painted on, making loud jokes at the reception desk, pretending to be unbothered. Yet the silence after each line was suffocating. Melissa, who used to share her lunch with me, now ate at her desk. Two nurses who once invited me out for coffee passed by, whispering to each other, their eyes glancing at me with pity before turning away. I overheard one of them say that Ethan had already consulted a lawyer, and my chest tightened, though I forced a grin and muttered under my breath that they didn't know the whole story. Damien avoided me completely, his once smug smirk replaced with discomfort. I cornered him in the break room, demanding he tell people it was just harmless fun, but he muttered that Ethan was his friend and that he didn't want to get involved. His retreat enraged me, and I snapped that he was weak, but the more I lashed out, the more alone I felt. I thought maybe Naomi could help me regain ground. I invited her over, and together we drafted another post for social media. I wanted people to see me as the victim of a controlling husband, to believe that I was being punished for being playful. I wrote about women who were shamed for being lively, about men who crushed joy with paranoia. Naomi hit like immediately, adding a comment about how unfair Ethan had always been, but the post gathered only a handful of other reactions. Some of my co-workers unfollowed me entirely. The silence online, once again, was more damning than insults. I refreshed the page over and over, searching for validation that never came. That weekend, I decided to show up at Amelia's school during dismissal. I told myself Ethan couldn't stop me from seeing my daughter, that she would run to me once she saw me waiting. I stood at the gate, forcing a wide smile, waving when the children began filing out. When Amelia spotted me, her small body froze. She looked from me to Ethan, who was waiting just a few steps away. I called her name, opening my arms, but she shook her head, clutching her backpack tighter. Ethan put a hand on her shoulder, guiding her past me. I shouted after them that he was poisoning her against me, that he was manipulating her, but Amelia buried her face against his side. Parents nearby stared at me, their eyes narrowing, some pulling their children closer. My cheeks burned, but I kept shouting, insisting I was being treated unfairly, that Ethan was brainwashing our daughter. He didn't look at me, not once. He led her to the car, his silence sharper than any words. When I returned to my apartment, another envelope was waiting under the door. My hand shook as I tore it open. More legal documents, requests for custody, supervised visitation, financial control. My name printed in black ink, alongside phrases like emotional instability and public humiliation. I shouted into the empty room that it was lies, that no one could take my daughter from me over a single kiss. But the words didn't echo the way I wanted them to. They fell flat, heavy, and meaningless. I called Naomi, reading the documents aloud, expecting her to laugh at the absurdity. Instead, her voice was hesitant. She said maybe I should take it seriously. Maybe Ethan wasn't bluffing this time. Her doubt stung worse than Margaret's insults, and I screamed at her, accusing her of abandoning me, of siding with him. She whispered that she didn't want to fight anymore and hung up. For the first time, I realized even she was slipping away. At work the next day, Melissa confronted me gently, saying she was worried about Amelia. She mentioned that the school had contacted Ethan about her being withdrawn, distracted, unlike herself. I brushed it off, insisting children bounced back, that Amelia was fine, that Ethan was using her to build a case. But Melissa's eyes told me she didn't believe me. I stormed out of the office, furious, repeating to myself that everyone was exaggerating. That evening, I drove back to the Varro house, determined to see Amelia, determined to prove I wasn't powerless. I pounded on the door until Ethan opened it, his lawyer standing calmly beside him. The lawyer explained that all communication needed to go through legal channels, that I wasn't permitted to come inside, that custody arrangements would be determined by the court. I screamed that they were conspiring, that Ethan was paranoid, that he was stealing my daughter. Ethan didn't reply. He just looked at me with that same steady silence. pity in his eyes instead of rage. Behind him, Amelia peeked from the stairs again, her small hand clutching the railing. Our eyes met, and I whispered her name, begging her to come to me. But she turned and climbed the stairs without a word. The door closed, leaving me on the porch with only the lawyer's folder in my hands. I walked back to my car, clutching the documents, the weight of them heavier than stone. My throat ached from shouting, my chest from breathing, but still I muttered to myself that it was only a game, that everyone else was wrong, that Ethan was paranoid. Yet deep inside, the silence from friends, the rejection from my daughter, and the calmness of Ethan's resolve told me the truth I didn't want to face. My laughter had become my downfall, and the game I insisted on playing had already been decided against me. The law office felt colder than I expected, the kind of space where even the polished wood and soft lighting couldn't disguise the sharpness of what was about to unfold. I walked in with my lawyer at my side, forcing a smirk I didn't feel, determined to make Ethan look like the paranoid one. He was already seated at the long table, his lawyer beside him, their folders stacked neatly like weapons waiting to be drawn. He didn't glare, didn't smirk, didn't even speak. He just sat there, calm, as if he already knew how this would end. That unnerved me more than I wanted to admit, so I straightened my shoulders and reminded myself that I still had a voice, still had laughter. If I repeated, it was just a game enough times, maybe even the judge would believe it. The meeting began with Ethan's lawyer, his voice measured and calm, cutting into me without ever raising his tone. First came the affidavits. Co-workers from the clinic had signed statements, describing how I laughed about Damien kissing me, how I bragged that Ethan couldn't take a joke, how I mocked him in the break room. Reading those words aloud in that cold room made my face burn. I interjected, saying co-workers always exaggerated, that gossip wasn't truth, but the lawyer pressed on, unshaken. My own lawyer shifted in his seat, his silence telling me even he couldn't defend my casual cruelty. Then the text appeared, projected on the screen, my own words backlit for everyone to see. Messages to Naomi where I had written that I wanted to push Ethan to see how far he'd break, calling him paranoid, mocking him for being too old-fashioned. I gasped and tried to explain that they were private, that they were jokes between friends, but the lawyer pointed out how easily those jokes lined up with my public behavior. My excuses sounded hollow even to me, and Ethan's calm silence made me feel smaller with each passing minute. Next were the screenshots of my social media posts. There they were, my words in bold text. Vacation flings keep marriages fresh. My husband is stuck in the past. At the time, people had laughed. I had felt empowered, validated. But now, in this setting, those same posts looked cruel, humiliating, evidence of deliberate mockery. I tried to laugh it off, saying no one takes social media seriously, but the lawyer replied that public humiliation leaves scars regardless of platform. I clenched my fists beneath the table, furious at how easily my own voice was being turned against me. The financial documents followed. Ethan had secured Amelia's accounts, taken control of household bills, ensured every necessity was covered. His lawyer explained it all with precision, framing it as protection for the child, not punishment for me. My stomach twisted as the judge asked me directly what steps I had taken to secure Amelia's future. I stammered, saying Ethan was cutting me off, strangling me financially. But compared to his neat lists, his careful planning, my words felt reckless and reactive. Even my lawyer didn't attempt to spin it. He only glanced down, avoiding my eyes. The worst came last. The teacher's report. Amelia's name printed on school letterhead, alongside words like withdrawn, anxious, hesitant. The teacher described how Amelia seemed quieter, how she no longer raised her hand in class, how she avoided eye contact when speaking. Tears pricked my eyes, but I shoved them down. I muttered that Ethan had planted these ideas, that children were resilient, that she was fine. My voice was sharp, dismissive, and the lawyer used that to underline his point. A mother who dismissed her child's distress was unfit to provide stability. The weight of the words hit harder than any evidence before, but I clenched my jaw, refusing to let Ethan see me falter. When Ethan finally spoke, his voice was steady and devastating. He said this wasn't about revenge. He said he wasn't trying to punish me but to protect Amelia. He explained that he had endured humiliation, that he had watched me laugh while undermining him, but that once it began to harm his daughter, he couldn't remain silent. He spoke with a calm conviction that made me feel like a storm, wild and unreasonable, thrashing against his stillness. He didn't accuse me of being evil or cruel. He just painted me as reckless, unstable, and the worst part was how easily his words aligned with the evidence laid out before us. I tried one last time to twist the narrative. I raised my voice, insisting it had been only a game, that Damien's kiss was meaningless, that Ethan was paranoid and insecure. I claimed he was punishing me for being confident, for refusing to shrink into the role of a quiet wife. But the silence that followed was crushing. My lawyer's face was pale, Ethan's eyes calm, and the judge's expression unreadable but heavy. For the first time, I wondered if my words were no longer shaping the story, but damning me instead. The meeting ended with timelines and deadlines, custody petitions, supervised visitation schedules, financial control confirmations, all laid out in neat lines. I signed acknowledgement forms with a trembling hand, forcing a smirk even as my chest felt hollow. Ethan stood, gathered his papers, and thanked his lawyer quietly. He didn't look at me with anger, didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He looked at me with pity, and that expression cut deeper than any insult. Back at my apartment, I spread the documents across the table, staring at them until the words blurred. I poured a glass of wine, whispering to myself again that it was just a game, just a joke, nothing more. But the stamps and signatures on those pages told another story. My laughter had become evidence, my jokes had become weapons against me, and Ethan's silence had become the blade that cut me cleanly out of my own home. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with beige walls and a wooden bench that looked almost ordinary, but the air inside pressed against me like a weight I couldn't escape. I sat at the defendant's table, my lawyer whispering for me to stay calm, to speak clearly, to remember that everything hinged on my demeanor. I nodded, though my palms were damp, my throat dry. Across the aisle, Ethan sat with his lawyer, calm as ever, his folders stacked neatly in front of him. He didn't look angry or triumphant, he looked steady, and somehow that steadiness was more unnerving than rage would have been. I told myself over and over that this was still my chance, that if I explained it right, if I laughed at the absurdity, I could make the judge see the truth. It was only a game. It was nothing. He was paranoid. The hearing began with Ethan's lawyer, his tone precise, controlled, almost surgical. He presented the affidavits first, co-workers' statements describing how I bragged about Damien's kiss, how I laughed at Ethan's discomfort, how I framed his reaction as weakness. Hearing their words read aloud stripped away the playful spin I had wrapped around them, exposing the cruelty underneath. I leaned forward, interrupting, saying co-workers loved to exaggerate, that gossip wasn't truth, but the judge raised her hand and told me to wait my turn. The reprimand cut deeper than I expected, shrinking me back into my chair. Next came the texts. My own words, printed on bright white paper, passed to the judge. Messages to Naomi, filled with lines about wanting to push Ethan, mocking him for being old-fashioned, calling him paranoid. I bit my lip, muttering that they were private, never meant to be used against me. The judge asked why I would write such things if they weren't true, and my voice faltered. I tried to laugh, to say people vented all the time, that it was humor, nothing more. But my laugh sounded sharp, hollow, brittle, and even my lawyer shifted uncomfortably beside me. The social media screenshots came next. My posts, preserved forever, projected onto the screen. Vacation flings keep marriages fresh. My husband wouldn't understand. He's too rigid. The courtroom was silent as the words glowed across the wall, louder than anything I could say. At the time, they had felt funny, rebellious, empowering. Here, they felt damning, childish, cruel. I whispered that social media was just noise, that everyone joked online. The lawyer calmly replied that public humiliation, no matter the medium, still carried weight. My stomach twisted, my smirk faltered. Then came the financial records. Ethan had secured Amelia's savings, locked down accounts, taken over bills, and set aside funds for school and household needs. His lawyer explained how each step was necessary for stability, not punishment. The judge asked what steps I had taken. My chest tightened as I stammered, saying Ethan had cut me off unfairly, that I couldn't plan when he was strangling me financially. But the neatness of his preparations made me look reckless, irresponsible. Even my lawyer's attempt to frame it as controlling fell flat against the paperwork. The final blow was Amelia's school report. Her teacher had written about her being quiet, withdrawn, distracted, no longer eager to join group activities. Reading the words made my eyes sting, but I blinked the tears back. I muttered that she was fine, that children were resilient, that Ethan was planting ideas. But the judge's gaze was sharp, her expression unimpressed. The weight of those notes was undeniable, and I knew it. I crossed my arms, glaring at the table, muttering again that it was just a game. Ethan spoke last. His voice was calm, deliberate, every word carrying more weight than my hours of excuses. He said he wasn't here for revenge, that he wasn't trying to destroy me. He said he was here to protect Amelia, to give her a home free of chaos and public mockery. He spoke of responsibility, of stability, of the need for consistency in a child's life. His restraint was devastating. He didn't shout, didn't accuse, didn't mock me. He simply described himself as steady, measured, dependable, and me as the opposite. His words painted a picture I could no longer erase. When it was my turn, I tried to reclaim the narrative. I said it had only been a kiss, a silly dare, a harmless game. I called Ethan paranoid, said he was punishing me for being lively, for refusing to be silent. My voice rose, sharper with every word, but the judge's expression didn't change. She asked simple questions. Why had I laughed when my husband was humiliated? Why had I mocked him online? Why had I dismissed my daughter's confusion as a game? My answers stumbled, brittle excuses that even I knew were collapsing under their own weight. The silence after I spoke was crushing. The ruling came swiftly. Temporary custody of Amelia awarded to Ethan. Financial control entrusted to him for stability. My visitation limited, supervised, subject to review. The gavel struck, sharp and final, and the sound echoed in my chest like a door slamming shut. My lawyer whispered about appeals, about fighting later, but his words were distant, muffled, meaningless. All I could hear was the silence of the courtroom, the calmness of Ethan's victory, the weight of papers sliding across the table for me to sign. Ethan gathered his folders neatly, thanking his lawyer with quiet dignity. He didn't look at me with triumph. He looked at me with pity, and that expression hollowed me out. Margaret nodded from the back, Harold sighed with relief, and Amelia peeked in from the hall, her small backpack slung over her shoulders. I whispered her name, my voice breaking, but she turned away, pressing closer to Ethan's side. That rejection, silent and soft, cut deeper than any ruling. I walked out of the courthouse clutching the papers, my hands shaking. I whispered again that it was just a game, that no one should take it so seriously. But the words carried no power anymore. They fell flat against the finality of the judgment, brittle echoes of the laughter that had once seemed so loud. Ethan's silence had won, the law had spoken, and the game I insisted on playing had finally ended. With me on the outside, holding nothing but paper and regret. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching,